Hi, and thanks for joining us for episode 17 of the Well Bible Reading Journey podcast. I'm so glad that you're joining us today. This week, we're going to be in Genesis 46, 47, 48. We're in Psalm chapter 16 and also Matthew chapter 16. So we're going to be looking at some of those, a little bit from each one, focusing in on Genesis and Psalms, maybe talking a little bit about Matthew as well. So I'm glad you're joining us this week. I pray God is blessing you as you go through the Well Bible Reading Journey with us every day, reading from God's Word. So I'm going to ask Amber and Craig to join me now because we want to hit it right away. Amber and Craig, thanks for joining us. Thanks for being here and being a part of it today. Good to have
Hello.
you. Good to have you. So we're going to start with Genesis chapter, I think 47. Is it what we wanted to kind of focus on today? A little bit of that. We'll be pulling in some of the others as well because it's all kind of one seamless story. Yeah. So Craig, what did you get this week reading Genesis chapter 47 in particular?
I had really three themes that I'd like to hit on if we have time. I'll start with kind of the overall progression of the story at this point, where Genesis 46 through 47 began to move the story from a person called Israel to a people called Israel. The author of Genesis provides both Joseph's reunion with his brothers and with his father, along with the list of the 70 members of Jacob's family who migrate to Egypt. We see that starting in verse 46, verse 8, with the quote Israelites, and concludes that list of descendants with the house of Jacob in verse 27. And this is the first signal we see of the shift of the focus from family to people that sets up the book of Exodus to come. I don't know if y'all have any comments you want to hit with that, but I have a couple of things on economics and politics that set that up after you guys weigh in.
Yeah, before we move on to that, I saw the exact same thing, and it reminded me back when we were reading the Abraham story. And God told Abraham that they were going to be sojourning for 400 years. And so this is the beginning of that. And I say this knowing it's probably not true, but I wonder if any of them were like, hey, I remember my great grandfather or my great 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 uncle. I mean, he had this, God told him that we are going to be exiled for 400 years. And as they entered Egypt, if any of them ever wondered, or the reason why Jacob even said, we are sojourning in this land, if he said it that way, because he kind of maybe had that feeling like this is the beginning of that long journey away from the promised land for 400 years. And as we know, because we can look backwards at the story, that they came in as 70, but they leave 400 years later, probably closer to 2 million people. So they definitely, that was quite a sojourn.
Yeah, it was. It is possible, I think, that Jacob had this sense of that history and that promise as the patriarch. He may have had some sense of God is doing something different here, and it may have something to do with that prediction, that prophecy, or that promise, if you will, that they would sojourn for that length of time. So yeah, I think you're right on, both of you guys, and especially in this idea of now they're moving from the patriarchs, and we're moving out of the time of the patriarchs. Really, really, Jacob is considered to be the last line of the patriarchal period, moving into the period of the formation of a nation. Now you have 12 tribes, and they begin to focus on the 12 tribes. And certain tribes rise above others in terms of how much space they get in the narrative, right? So I mean, Reuben and Judah, and of course Joseph and Benjamin seem to have a little bit more space than some of the other tribes. But it really moves that emphasis to this is a nation that is forming. So I think, Craig, maybe your question was, uh, what's the kind of socio-political, economical stuff going on? Because there's a lot of economics in this part of the story. They're dealing with famine, which was very common in those days. It was not uncommon for the famine to hit in the entire Middle East, area. So for them, the whole world was starving, was coming to Egypt for that reason. Uh, but I think, ultimately, it's just brilliant when you look back on it that God places them in Egypt. They're going to be there for 400 years. And I see it as very much this incubator time where Israel moves from being really a hunting and foraging kind of society, and then also an agriculturalist society. They were in animal husbandry. They had flocks and herds, so they were nomadic. They moved from place to place. They lived in tents. They moved from place to place. And it's very difficult, if not impossible, to become a great nation when you're a nomadic people. The nomadic tribes were never able to flourish because they were constantly moving, and it was very dangerous. People died. They had tribal wars. It was a very difficult life. And here in Egypt, they learned how to become more agricultural than even animal husbandry, even though they start off as shepherds and flocks and so forth. But eventually they begin to plant. This is the first time that the people of Israel actually plant themselves somewhere. In this case, the land of Goshen. Talk a little bit about that, but they plant themselves for 400 years so they can develop. To Amber's point, they go from 120 people or so that come over to 2 million, it's estimated, right, by the time of the Exodus. I mean, that's some pretty massive. That now you're a nation, right? In those days, that was a lot of people. And so I see this happening there in Egypt. And you think about Egypt too. Not only did they have the opportunity now to stay and really grow and become a nation, become one people group, because when you're in a culture where you're different from them, you stick together. They were kind of segregated into this area called Goshen, which was on the mouth of the Nile where it dumps into the Mediterranean Sea. It was a very rich, kind of soil rich area, so they get to flourish there. But they're also sticking together. They have to stick together, right, as people. And so they just grow into this amazing people group there. But you also think about Egypt. Uh, what a brilliant thing for God to do, to have them in Egypt in particular, because Egypt was the most advanced civilization on the face of the earth. You see the pyramids, you see all the great things they've done. We have even archaeologists and geologists today can't even. There are some things about how they built the pyramids we still haven't figured out how they did it. How did they do this? So when you think about the mathematics involved, the science, the weaponry, the chariots, which the Egyptians didn't invent but they perfected, uh, and so this
The
is
calendaring and the sense of time they invented also.
yes, yeah, time, all those things, astronomy, all this stuff that was flourishing in Egypt. And so God, like he embeds his people into this most advanced society on the face of the earth. And you have to know that the Hebrew people learned so much from the Egyptians. And after 400 years, they were almost more Egyptian than they were Hebrew, right? Moses comes back and actually has to remind them who they were. Hey, you were the people. You're the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Do you remember? Right? He has, and he's the most powerful God. He's the God above all other gods. The Egyptian gods are nothing compared to your God. It was almost like they had forgotten that because they become so Egyptian in their thinking and their ways. But it was the most advanced culture on the face of the earth, and God planted them there and said, "Flourish, right? Grow."
And I find it fascinating that the Bible gives us a little bit of an insight onto the effect of what Joseph did to save the, the chosen family, Jacob and his family. What he what Joseph did for them, what the result and impact was for the Egyptians. In verses 13 through 26, we see basically an account of worldly politics and economic power games. We know the economy of heaven doesn't work through settled accounts and transactions, at least not since Jesus died and was resurrected for us in our sins. But here in Genesis 47, we see the world's system of economics and power politics in overdrive. People who paid taxes in the form of grain during the times of plenty now are made to buy that very food back that they paid in taxes in the times of famine. Is that fair? I mean, I think what God is doing here is brilliant from a chosen people, the Israelites growing into a nation perspective. But what Joseph does here from an Egyptian standpoint is totally fascinating, and the Bible shares it.
Yeah,
Essentially, the slave who came into Egypt saves Egyptians through enslavement.
yeah. No,
The
it
world was
does.
turned on its head, right?
Yeah, it's kind of a hard one to read and to really understand. I think the biggest kind of like the takeaway or maybe the message that maybe the writer was trying to send was how much Joseph enriched Egypt, how much Egypt owed to Joseph. And there is this sense almost like in each of the stories, we talked a little bit about this with the interaction, which we'll get to. it's in 47. The interaction between Jacob and Pharaoh is very interesting. And Amber, I want you to speak to that in a minute. But it's really interesting that they come in, and whether it's Joseph or Jacob in particular, and it's almost in these conversations like they're the regal ones. Like it's not fair. It's like they have this kind of ability to bless, and almost like Joseph is like brilliant. He's a brilliant manager. And he's a brilliant person, and it's almost like he's the one who enriches Egypt, and he's really, you see that he's actually fighting for what's best for Egypt, and even as he enslaves all these people, and they were bond servants. It wasn't slavery as in, when we think of slavery, we think of American slavery. It wasn't like American slavery. It was a different type of slavery, but it was still this kind of servitude that you owed. It was a debt you owed, and you had to pay it back. If you didn't have the money or the grain or the cattle to pay, you had to pay it with the sweat of your brow. It was sweat labor, right, that you had to pay it with. So that's, yeah, you're right. That's very interesting because it seems, well, that seems like he's enslaving people and doing evil, and God seems to use it anyway. But Amber, you had just speak a little bit to that conversation between Jacob and Pharaoh, because that's in this section and it's really interesting.
Yeah, I when I was reading, I tend to highlight underline things that stick out to me so I can come back to them later. And so I was reading through here, I underlined where Jacob in verse 7, when he's introduced to Pharaoh, he blesses him. And so I underlined it to come back to. And then just a couple verses later in verse 10, this is after their conversation, which I also want to talk about. It says Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out. And I was like, wait, didn't he already bless him once? And I know from past studies here with our podcasting, anytime things are mentioned twice, we should pay attention.
Right.
So I paid attention, but I wasn't quite sure how to handle it. So I was like, okay, Jacob blesses Pharaoh twice here. Is he just, paying him some respect, like kindness for thank you for letting us be in your land and letting us stay in Goshen? This is a thank you, bless you, thank you. Or is this something else? Like for us, it almost looks like the lower is blessing the higher because Pharaoh is, Jacob's people are about to starve to death, and here they are having to move to Egypt. But if you think about it in a worldly way, Pharaoh was greater. But if you think about it in a godly way, Jacob was anointed by God. He held the promise. And so wonder if there was something else happening here. So Ellis, help me understand why there's twice he blessed him.
Yeah, he blesses him at the beginning of the conversation before he even starts,
Hmm.
and then he blesses him again at the end of the conversation. And that's extremely interesting to me. And I think you're right. When the scripture does that, it bookends this conversation between Pharaoh and Jacob. Jacob, to Craig's point earlier, you see almost like Jacob coming into his own, like he also is the ruler over a nation that is still in its infancy,
Right.
but you see these two almost, to your point, Amber, almost as their equals, or maybe even
Hmm.
Jacob is greater than Pharaoh, which you would not expect in this situation. Jacob's coming to be saved by
Right.
Egypt, literally through the famine. But I think there's several things going on here. I mean, one is that the blessing is a way of basically saying thank you. So he's blessing him. It's a way of saying thank you, like just bless you. Like if you do something, someone does something for you, and you say, "Oh, bless you for that," right? But there's also this sense that there's a power behind the blessing, and the Hebrew people were very much in this. We see, the we see the sons fighting for the blessing, right? The blessing of the father. Everyone wants the father to bless them. So
Hmm.
later on in this story, Jacob will begin to bless the tribes. He'll bless Joseph's two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Interesting scene as well. But yeah, I think there is this sense where Jacob has this power even over Pharaoh through the blessing. You may have all the worldly power, the physical power, but I have a power to bring to this relationship as well. And that is the power of the God Most High. And I'm going to bless you for what you're doing. I think there's very much that power dynamic going on. And Jacob is in no way subservient to Pharaoh in this scene. I think that they wanted you to see that for sure. Yeah. Um,
And as we talk about that, let's talk about what's squished in the middle. Can we do that for a second?
yeah. It's interesting how Joseph answers the question, right? I mean,
That's
Jacob.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So Pharaoh asked Jacob, "How old are you?" probably
Right.
because he probably's never seen anyone quite this old. I don't think that they live quite as
I don't
long
know. Yeah,
in
he's getting up
Egypt. I'm
there.
not sure. But he's like, "How old are you?" And his answer is so interesting. It's like, "The days of the years of my pilgrimage is 130." And I was like, "I'm gonna do that." When someone asks me how old I am, I'm like, "The days of my time here on earth," like I'm just gonna start saying it like this. It's very poetic. It's
It
interesting.
is.
And then he says, "They were few and evil have the days of the years of my life been." And I was like, "That's a really interesting way to present yourself. Almost kind of give him a life, like I'm 130 and things haven't been awesome this whole time,
Yeah.
and here I am, soul journeying. I'm not immigrating to your land. I'm only here temporarily, hopefully." Right? He's kind of saying about his story, and so I thought of it this way: Jacob kind of has a little bit of a pessimistic view here. I don't know if it's because he thinks he's on the going to die soon. So he's kind of at the end of his life, kind of thinking back on his life. But I thought of a couple things. Everything Jacob is saying here is true, of course. I mean, it is short, few, and evil, because he lived on the road and on the run most of his life.
Mhm.
He had his own sins and guilt to deal with, but he also was cheated, mistreated, and betrayed by his own family. His daughter was violated. We remember that story. His beloved wife died in childbirth. We remember that story with Benjamin. His favored son was thought to have been killed by a wild animal. He feels like he's close to death, and it's 50 years younger than his own father was. And that's sort of the way he views his life right now. But I want us to remember all the things we've been reading over the last few weeks and months together, is that he could also have perspective of the same events a little differently. So Jacob has also been greatly blessed by God. He escaped the brother who wished to kill him. He became vastly wealthy at the expense of his father in law, who tried to cheat him. He was given 12 sons and dozens of grandchildren. His lost son, who he thought was dead, is Joseph, has now been restored to him. Him and his family are being saved on the edge of starvation. They're being saved here. And
Mhm.
above all, he carries this powerful promise of God that his fathers carried, the promise. And not to mention the countless experiences he's had with God personally. I wish I've experienced a few of those, angels and wrestling with God at times in my life, right? There's so much good that also is happening here. So it's all about perspective. He's at the end of his life. He kind of gives Pharaoh the it's been hard, but there also has been a lot of good as we've been reading this story.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. So you can approach it from two different directions, and Jacob seems to be a kind of more of a pessimistic kind of a.
Hmm.
My Bible translates that the years few and unpleasant. I know that the
Mm,
one that some have evil, but
hmm.
basically the idea behind evil is few, and it's been a rough ride, right? It's not been easy, right?
Hmm.
Which certainly for Jacob it hasn't. There is this sense too, I think, in some of that of maybe a little bit of a confession, because a lot of what Joseph has experienced has been his fault. I mean,
Sure.
it's been he made bad choices. He did some bad things. He did some wrong things, and so it's almost all like this confession time where my life has been rough and hard, and a lot of that has been my fault, right? And now but it's interesting that he decides to couch it that way, because you're absolutely right, Amber. I mean, in with those bad things that happen, God keeps rescuing him again and again
That's
and
right.
again, and God still blesses him. He has more children than any of the other patriarchs, and he is the father. He's going to be considered the father of the tribes. Where Abraham's the father of the nation, Jacob is it takes on his name. He's Israel. He becomes
Right.
Israel, right? And so eventually, this nation will take on his name, and so all of that pain and all of that suffering and all of that hardship uh, pays off in the end. Right? It pays off.
Right.
And maybe he hasn't seen the payoff. Although I think you're right. Look, you just got your son back. Why are you
Right.
so negative, right?
Hmm.
You just got your son back, and so I think that's a pretty instructive to us, where we can be like that, right? That we don't see the blessings, we only see the bad stuff, and so when we approach life that way, it's important. Awesome. What else in 47? Anything else that somebody wanted to bring up? Craig, you said you had several things.
Yeah, I hit the first two, the overall theme of where we're at in the story, the person becoming of Israel becoming a people of Israel, the
Mhm.
economics and political power games. You've hit well on that, Ellis, and covered that. Third thing is, and Amber, you touched on this a little bit up at top. 120 people become 2 million. But we see here in chapter 47, verse 27, it says that the family of Abraham is fruitful and multiplied exceedingly. So we see here the words fruitful and multiply. We've seen them occur throughout Genesis, but this one is unique. Previously, God has either commanded his people to be fruitful and multiply, or he's promised that they will be. Here we actually find it turning into a reality through the outstanding leadership of Joseph, and
Mm.
the seed and family of Abraham flourish.
Yeah. No, that's right on. This is the scene. This is the moment. It's the beginning of it's the birth of a nation in a lot of ways. Then the promise of for Abraham. It's not there yet, but you know it is coming, and it is in Goshen that's going to happen. Actually, yeah,
And the last thing I had, Ellis, was that I thought it was interesting that Jacob, because I've been talking about Jacob this chapter more than anyone else. It's interesting that Jacob lives another 17 years, because it seems like when he meets Pharaoh, he's kind of towards the end of his days. Everyone thinks that he's towards the end of his
yeah,
days. And he lives another 17 years
yeah,
in Egypt. I mean, that
yeah.
he's flourishing with his family, his new nation, right? What I thought was interesting when I saw the 17 years, it reminded me that in I had to go back and look. I didn't remember. I had to go back and look. But in chapter 37, verse 2, Joseph was actually 17 years old when his brothers sold him to Egypt. Um, and so what I thought was interesting is the first 17 years of Joseph's life, Jacob was the one who nourished and took care and loved on his son. And then here, his last 17 years of his life, now it's Joseph's turn to nourish Jacob. I thought that was just really interesting. 17 years.
Yeah, that is cool. I'd never seen that before. Thank you for pointing that out. It's
Mhm.
almost like this beautiful bookends
Right.
to this part of Jacob's life, where the first 17 years he's pouring into Joseph, and of course we know Joseph was the favorite. Joseph
Mhm.
got the coat, he got everything, so he's nurturing Joseph, not knowing that what he's grooming Joseph for, nurturing for, is this amazing thing that's going to happen, where Joseph is going to be instrumental in saving the whole Mediterranean world.
Right.
And then the last 17 years, now it's the son taking care of the father, and that's what happens in life, isn't it? You raise kids, they grow up, and then eventually, hopefully, I don't know about mine. I may have to count on my Social Security with mine, but they're supposed to take care of you, right, at the end.
It's a
Yeah,
beautiful reversal.
it is. It's beautiful. It's awesome. Amazing. Okay, great. Hey, we move on, I guess, to Psalm 16, which we don't really get to do Psalms very much in these, but this is a very famous one. Preserve me, O God, for I take refuge in you. I said to the Lord, you are my Lord. I have no good besides you. It's this psalm of worship that's attributed to David. The title of Miktam, right, of David. So, Craig, what did you kind of looking at this psalm? What are some things that popped up at you?
So I was really fascinated by that word miktam. I'll be honest, I've not paid attention to it before in
Yeah.
years of Bible study. Another benefit of the well is that in these podcasts, as you start paying a little bit more attention, as Amber has called out many times before, the connections she's made.
Hmm.
But the Psalm 16 subtitle of a miktam of David, what is that? What's a miktam? So this word is found in the headings of not only Psalm 16, but also Psalms 56 through 60. People have apparently not found a satisfactory answer for what it means, though. But the modern Hebrew word comes close to meaning epigram. So, I don't know if that helps us or not in context. So, digging a little bit more into how the Psalms portray themselves, what comes across in the Psalms. In these six Psalms, Psalm 16 does begin with a cry to God for protection. Couple that with Psalm 58 denouncing the wicked, and Psalm 60 also being an instruction in times of danger. So we start to think that maybe a miktam is a psalm that teaches us how to think about God and how to behave in the face of adversity. Or if we're under extreme duress, how are we supposed to respond and come to God and have a posture of faithfulness and finding what we should do in response to our circumstance. And that is obviously, as Psalm 16 goes on to say, we put our trust in God, we find refuge in him. Because when in verse 1, Psalm 16 says, as you said, for I take my refuge in you, O God, that's really finding trust in God. It's finding, recognizing God's sovereignty and living in our dependence upon God.
Hmm.
And that's compared to what we've seen humans problem, humans, the source of humanity's problems and their issues in life go all the way back to the garden in the fall of Genesis 3. Rather than trusting in and walking with God, and we end up wanting to do things our own way. We currently rebel against doing what he says, understanding who we are, and we want to instead do it on our own ability and say who we are and define ourselves.
Hmm.
So, as opposed to doing that, the psalmist in 16 is saying, I will find my refuge in you, and I will find my rest in you. And ultimately, I'll find who I am in you and my purpose. And just to close out this section, in Psalm 15 last week, the psalmist asks the question to God in verse 2, who may abide in your tent and who may dwell in your holy hill? Again, that's Psalm 15. Sorry, that's verse 1 where that question is asked. But in verse 2, the answer is, he who walks blamelessly and does what is right and speaks truth in his heart, that's the one who will dwell in the hill or the house of the Lord. So essentially, the righteous are the ones who dwell in God's tent and abide in his hill, and they are the ones in his presence. And now in Psalm 16, we see those who trust in the Lord find their refuge and their protection in him.
That's good. Yeah, yeah. These psalms, all the psalms do it to some degree, but these actually are really strong and actually just pointing us back to our complete and total utter dependence on God for everything. Yeah, yeah. Amber, did you get anything out of the beginning of this psalm or the part of this psalm?
Yeah, I was starting to dig into different words, and I got stuck on the word delight, and so I started looking that up a little bit deeper, and I found that in Hebrew, delight can be translated two different ways, like the root word, but in English we just say delight either way, no matter which one it is.
Mhm.
And when I was looking it up, it was really interesting that the one of the words for delight is spelt Rasa or Racha, which I can't roll my R's, but you
That's
know,
it. Yeah.
it's Racha, and it's spelled Rasa, and that struck me so strongly. Some of you guys know because I've shared on here that my daughter has a rare medical condition, but specifically, what causes her condition is a mutation of a gene, and the gene that's mutated is the Rasa gene. And I was like, that's spelled the exact same way. We
Uh,
say Rasa gene.
yeah.
I'm gonna start calling Rasha on G now. But
There you go.
I don't know. God, it struck me that I've never looked at my daughter's condition. I've looked at her with delight and joy, but I've never seen her condition. So this word rasa in delight actually means to be pleased with or to accept favorably. And so I don't know. God really struck me this week, even though it has nothing to do with the psalm specifically. But that word, I just am going to see her condition with different eyes, and I'm going to accept it favorably, and that God is going to do something great and
Mm,
delight in
mm.
her and what she has going on.
That is so beautiful. That's exactly what the Word of God is supposed to do, Amber. It speaks to you right where you are,
Mhm,
and that's an amazing insight. The difference between able to say, I delight in my daughter,"
mhm,
but can I actually delight in her this condition, right? Because in some ways, I mean, that condition it's part of who she is, right?
mhm,
It's part of the way God made her. He has His reasons, and we don't understand them, but to be able to delight in that is an amazing, powerful, and difficult, right
mhm,
move. So I'm glad God gave you that word. That's a powerful word for it, and a powerful way to see what's happening with that. Thank you for sharing that.
mm, yeah.
Yeah. Anything else, guys, in the psalm? I mean, it's a beautiful psalm, and I think it really lifts up God, and it's one of those where he's struggling and wanting and asking, pleading with God to help him. Yeah.
I would, if we want to close it out with this, but in verses 3 and 4, there's I found the wording a little bit odd in the NRSV. As for the holy ones in the land, they are the noble, in whom is all my delight. We're talking about God and finding refuge and protection in Him, and then we're shifting to noble ones in the land. Some authors, some translators, I'm sorry, including the New American Bible, translate that a little bit differently. And the New American Bible translation is, "Worthless are all the false gods of the land. Accursed are all who delight in them." We probably don't know which is right, but just a little bit of food for thought, that there's some disagreement there. But I do love the way the Message translates verse 4, because I think this gets to really the core of the theme here for the entire psalm.
Hmm.
The Message says, "Don't just go shopping for a god. Gods are not for sale. I swear I'll never treat God names like brand names."
Mm.
Our search for God isn't, looking for the one who will bless us the most, who we can con and try to get the most out of. It is really faithfulness and trust and a journey that in the end equals righteous living, because we are true to Him. And as we will see throughout the rest of Israel's story, they become unfaithful to God, and we see what that brings to them. And Jesus uses the language of unfaithfulness to represent those who are not righteous in the end, right?
Yeah.
And we know we have righteousness only through Him, but it's that faithful steadfastness that faith gets to, that the life of faith gets to.
Absolutely. Very good. Very good. Well, the Psalms have so much to say to us. They both actually just kind of inspire us in this kind of beautiful poetic way, right? As poetry does. But they also have something important to teach us. Thanks for those insights, guys. Wanted to end really quick. I wanted to go to Matthew 16. We didn't necessarily have this on our schedule. I know you guys didn't have a lot of time to spend on Matthew 16. We were going to focus on Genesis and Psalms, but there's this one part of Matthew 16 that I think is super important. I didn't want to let it get away, and that is where Peter proclaims Jesus to be Messiah, right? Jesus is asking him, "Who do people say that I am?" Some say you're Elijah, some say you're John the Baptist reincarnated, other, one of the prophets. Jesus says, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter makes this great confession: "You are the Messiah, the Son of God." And Jesus says, "That's right. Good job, Peter. That was not revealed to you by any man. That's a divine revelation." And then he goes into and on this Petros, this rock, I will build my church. That's a little controversial. Not sure. Catholics say one thing, we tend to say it's something else. And then there's this great reversal where now Jesus is saying, "And by the way, Peter's right on the Messiah, which means I'm going to have to go to Jerusalem. Evil men are going to hand me over. I'm going to be crucified. I'm going to die, rise again." Peter pulls him aside, says, "Stop saying that. That's not true. You're not going to die." And Peter and Jesus, the one who just made this great proclamation, Peter, the one that the Petros is going to build the rock up, build the church on, he's now calling him Satan, right? "Get behind me, Satan." So, what's going on with that? And I don't know if you guys have any thoughts or questions on that. Maybe you have more questions than thoughts. That's fine. I've studied it a little bit, but I just wanted to kind of bring that out there.
Yeah, we certainly see the dual nature of the Petros or the rock or the church play out throughout church history. I'm a history buff as well as a theology buff, and I love reading history books themselves about different
Hmm.
periods and chronicles of history. And church history is as fascinating as anything. And it's amazing how much we talked about Genesis 47 and how much politics and economics played in what Joseph was doing there in Egypt and how that started the Israelite nation. But that's the same throughout the church. I mean, we look at what happened with the church in the early 300s AD Roman Empire and how Constantine came to power, and that's really the catapulting of the church into power. And since then, we've had this problem of how do we honor the relationship with the world's rulers and the world's systems while still remaining faithful to God. I don't think we've gotten it right. I think we're making a journey, but it is a journey or a sojourn. Back to Amber's earlier point.
That continues to be the issue, doesn't it? Even to this very day, even in our own country, this balance between church and state, and that whenever the church marries the state, there's this power corrupts, and it tends to corrupt, and that kind of thing. Historically, when the church is married to the church does not elevate the state to a higher level. Usually, the state drags the church down into the mud, right, with politicians, and so you definitely see that. Amber, did you have any questions or thoughts on that?
Yeah, the only thing is that it always strikes me that he says, "Get behind me, Satan," and how he says that. And it always strikes me that we give Satan a really authority, like this name of Satan. And
Hmm.
God doesn't see Satan as a thing or as a person. He sees it as humans not seeing God for who he is it makes sense. Like, I don't know if I'm making sense, but I think sometimes we place Satan as this big authority of thing, and Peter's not literally Satan. So why
Right.
would Jesus say that? He's saying it because the Peter's mind and misunderstanding of God in that moment made him not have see God for who he is. I think we give Satan, I call him the Satan, because when you say Satan, it's just like saying God. We should call him the evil one or the deceptor. He is not Satan. He's the deceptor, the evil one. He is not Satan. So I don't know, that's just something I've learned when I read this passage.
Cool. Yeah, that's good. Let me talk a little bit about that, the get behind me part. So yeah, so Jesus says to him, "Get behind me, Satan." And the interesting thing for me there is that what 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 Peter has done here, and it has to do with Craig, you were talking about the politics that's going on, and Amber, you also mentioned about the disciple, this kind of reversal where he was this, he's being this makes this great confession, and then suddenly what's happened, and then we talked a little bit about this track through history where the church has always struggled with this dual almost nature, right? So you see the sin nature and you see this ability to have this amazing divine kind of inspiration. You see it happening in Peter both ways. But what Jesus is actually doing with Peter is he's redirecting him. So Peter very much had his mind on politics. So it was in this moment, Messiah doesn't die, we overthrow Rome, you sit on your throne, right? We win. Messiah doesn't lose, Messiah wins, right? And Jesus is saying to Peter, in a sense, okay, you have gotten ahead of me. You're out in front of me and going in a very different direction, the direction I'm going. So I need you to get behind me. Basically, get back behind me and follow me where I'm going. The word that he uses for get behind me is the exact same word he uses when he calls his disciples, when he says, follow me. When he say in the scenes where there's fishing and he comes and says, follow me and I will make you fishers of men. That word follow me is the word get behind me. It's the same word. What he's calling Peter to do, and what he calls us to do as well when we get out ahead of Jesus, because that happens to us all the time, right? We know what we want. We know what we think is best for us. So we're constantly running out ahead of Jesus, right? And then we get slammed and we're wondering why. And Jesus is saying, you got ahead of me, right? You got ahead of me and I wasn't taking you that direction. I'm trying to take you this direction, but you got out ahead of me, right?
Mm-hmm.
So get back behind me so that you can go in the right direction. And I think the thing about Satan was kind of like this, just a way of saying, when you do that, you are now operating in Satan's world.
Mm-hmm.
You're operating as Satan operated, who rebelled against God. You're trying to do it on your own. And anytime you try to do that, Peter, you're going to get in trouble. And so I think this is a really important word to us. You can have this amazing time with God and have this amazing insight. And in the very next step, fall into a pit, right? And do the wrong thing. And so it's very instructive for us. Peter, his whole life is very instructive for us. I love studying Peter. Very instructive. He's an amazing person, but a human being, right? And made mistakes. So here's one of them, and it's a pretty cool place where Jesus says, "Get back in line, Peter, and follow me, and don't ever tell me I'm wrong again."
You ever play Geronimo growing up in track and cross country? Geronimo, have you played that game growing
No,
up? Or is
no.
that a Missouri thing?
Okay, it must be a Missouri thing. What is it?
Geronimo was a game where the person in front would be running, and then the person in the back had to run past the person in the front, and they would yell Geronimo, and the next person in the back would have to run in front. And so it's like Peter is playing Geronimo, and Jesus is like, no, I'm the front person here.
Yeah,
what are you doing?
that's right. Yeah.
For all my runners, they'll appreciate that comment.
That's awesome. That's cool. Hey guys, it's been a great podcast. Thank you so much for all your hard work you put into studying this, and just the insights you bring to us, Craig and Amber, every week is so amazing and awesome. I'm thankful for you. Thankful for you guys out there watching. I pray that God will bless you this week as you study his word. He's going to give you so many insights. Please share them with us in the comment section below. We'd love to hear how God is speaking to you. We love to hear how God is doing amazing things in your life through the Well Bible Reading Journey. And I hope that and if you don't have that, there's a link also in the description that will be able to get you to that Well Bible Reading Journey online if that's what you want. But we love that you're taking this journey with us, and we pray that God blesses you this week as you serve Him. God bless you.